China's fascinating history goes back thousands of years, and over that period of time, its civilization has undergone some truly amazing changes. In this program, we will take a look at China's history from the time of its first emperor up to the present day. China takes its name from its first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who conquered 6 kingdoms to create the Empire of China over 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. The first emperor was a brutal man with an enormous ego, and he only ruled China for 11 years. During the Qin dynasty, the period when men of the Qin family ruled China, China's boundaries looked like this, and the country was considerably smaller than it is today. Surprisingly, a large number of things created during the ancient Qin dynasty have survived to this day. Perhaps the most interesting of them is the emperor's silent army seen here. It consists of thousands of realistic life-size clay statues that were buried near his tomb and that were intended to protect him in the afterlife. No doubt, many of the soldiers represented here helped the first emperor conquer the kingdoms from which he forged the original empire of China. And these soldiers also would have helped to enforce his harsh laws, collect his heavy taxes, and carry out his command that all books in the defeated kingdoms, except medical books, be destroyed by fire. The second and most famous legacy of the Qin dynasty is the winding stone barrier seen here, called the Great Wall of China. In order to keep invaders out of his empire, the first emperor ordered the construction of the Great Wall in the year 214 BC. Although little of the original wall remains today, it linked together several already existing shorter walls, and over the centuries, the Great Wall of China grew to be many thousands of miles long. The first emperor relied on the forced labor of as many as 1 million people to build the Great Wall, which resulted in an enormous and tragic loss of life. And in the end, both the ruthless exploitation of people and the waste of China's financial resources led to the downfall of the Qin dynasty. It was in the year 202 BC that men from the Han family began to rule China. The Han emperors rejected the harsh ways of the Qin dynasty and created a strong centralized government based on the teachings of the great Chinese philosopher Confucius. During the Han dynasty, China conquered lands to the north of the Great Wall, and the nation's territory more than doubled in size, while its population increased to 50 million people. And during the Han dynasty, the arts and sciences thrived, paper was invented, and Buddhism reached China from India. Also at this time, an overland trade route that came to be called the Silk Road was established that linked China to the distant lands of the Roman Empire. Because during the Han dynasty, Rome became a leading world power by overthrowing the great empire of ancient Greece, by conquering Egypt and the rest of northern Africa, and by conquering vast parts of Western Asia and Europe as well. It was also during the Han dynasty that Christianity spread rapidly across the Roman Empire. And it is interesting to note that whereas the powerful and sophisticated European civilization of ancient Rome was at its peak during the Han dynasty, at the same time an equally high level of civilization and tremendous political and military power existed in China too. Nevertheless, rivalries among the emperor's relatives and high government officials brought about the collapse of the Han dynasty in the year 220 AD. After the fall of the 400-year-old Han dynasty, strong centralized government vanished in China, and the Chinese Empire split up into separate states that battled one another for nearly the next 4 centuries. However, it was during the era of the Warring States that Buddhism spread across China. In Europe, the powerful Roman Empire split apart as well, and then in 476 AD, uncivilized barbarians conquered Rome. Thereafter, European civilization entered a period called the Dark Ages, when learning and artistic achievement declined. While during this same period, far away in North and South America, certain native civilizations built fabulous cities and thrived. But of course, at that time, the people of Europe and China were still completely unaware of the existence of those 2 continents. Strong centralized government finally returned to China in the year 581 AD, when emperors from the Sui family reunified China. But 37 years later, a revolt of the Chinese people ended the Sui dynasty, and the first in a long line of Tang emperors began to rule China. Under the Tang rulers, the government of China became very highly organized, and more difficult tests were required of those who wished to work for the emperors. And during this era, the capital of China was the great walled city of Xi'an, seen here. However, this city was much more than just the headquarters of the imperial government. It was a thriving center of international trade as well. That was because Xi'an was where the Silk Road to Europe began. And it was from here that during the Tang dynasty, and even earlier, camels were loaded with bales of silk and other valuable goods for a long, treacherous journey west. The Silk Road actually consisted of several different trade routes, but the main route from Xi'an ended in the cities of Tyre and Antioch on the Mediterranean Sea. It is important to note that it was during the Tang dynasty that Arab traders who traveled the Silk Road helped spread the brand new faith of Islam across Asia to China. Silk is a very fine type of cloth that has played a surprisingly important role in history, because from the days of the Roman Empire, and for many centuries thereafter, little or no silk was produced in Europe, and most silk arrived in the West from China in small quantities on the backs of camels. This made it both a rare and very valuable item of trade. Today, the age-old process of making silk begins by raising silkworms on the leaves of mulberry trees. Eventually, the silkworms, which are actually caterpillars, spin cocoons like those seen here and start to develop into moths. These cocoons are processed to loosen the silk threads. Then special machines unwind the cocoons and collect the threads. After that, the threads are usually colored with dyes and woven into finished rolls of cloth like these. The lucrative trade in silk was barely affected when a series of military rebellions drove the Tang emperors from the throne. The collapse of the Tang dynasty caused China to break apart into 5 kingdoms that were eventually reunited by a new emperor from the Song family. During the Song dynasty, that began in the year 960, the system of government examinations started by the Tangs became firmly established, and these exams dramatically shifted power away from the aristocratic families to the people who were the most gifted. Also, Neo-Confucianism, a philosophy that combined elements of Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, was officially adopted by the Song dynasty, a policy that all the later dynasties of China would come to support. The Song dynasty was also the era when gunpowder, movable type for printing, and the magnetic compass for navigation were invented in China. Meanwhile, far away in Europe, the Song dynasty was the era of the High Middle Ages, the time when Catholics began to build amazing cathedrals like this one, a time of knights in armor, when huge stone castles dotted the land. And it was toward the end of the Song dynasty that horsemen from Mongolia, led by Genghis Khan, conquered a vast region of Central Asia. By the year 1279, the grandson of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, had overthrown the last emperor of the Song dynasty and established the Mongol Yuan dynasty. It was during the Yuan dynasty that China achieved its maximum size by being united with the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. And it was also during the Yuan dynasty that a man named Marco Polo became the first European to write a book about China. Marco Polo came from Venice, a rich and powerful Italian city-state that controlled a mighty trading empire. In fact, nearly all of the luxury goods that reached the West on the Silk Road ended up being carried to Europe on Venetian ships. As a result, Venice pretty much controlled the prices of those goods. In the year 1271, Marco Polo sailed from Venice to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea, and then for 3 years he traveled down the Silk Road to China. After spending nearly 2 decades in that country and getting to know Kublai Khan quite well, Marco Polo returned to Venice, loaded down with valuable treasures from the emperor as well as a letter to the Pope. And the book Marco Polo wrote about his travels inspired Europeans to learn more about Chinese inventions, customs, and institutions of government. In the year 1368, following a period of violent uprisings, the Mongolian Yuan emperors of China were overthrown, and the Ming dynasty was established. It was during the early part of the Ming dynasty that construction began in Beijing on the huge complex of buildings and palaces seen here, known as the Forbidden City. And it was in the Forbidden City that all of China's future emperors would live and administer the imperial government. Both before and during the time that the construction of the Forbidden City began, Ming Emperor Yangli sent out ships to explore along the coastline of Asia as far as the east coast of Africa. Interestingly, at that same time, European ships from Portugal were exploring Africa's west coast, trying to find a sea route to India and China. For the Portuguese knew that a sea route, which would bypass the Silk Road, would allow them to take control of the rich trade in luxury goods and spices from East Asia. But these explorers also sought to spread Christianity into East Asia too. Finally, Vasco da Gama succeeded in reaching India from Portugal by sailing around the tip of Africa. And 16 years after that, Portuguese explorers and the Catholic missionaries they brought with them reached the port of Canton in Ming Dynasty, China. The Ming Dynasty was brought to an end in 1644, when forces from Manchuria, to the north of China, conquered the great Chinese Empire. The Manchurians were the founders of the Manchu, or Qing Dynasty. They had their own language and believed themselves to be superior to the Chinese. Nevertheless, Manchu emperors actively supported Confucian values and traditional Chinese culture. The early part of the Qing dynasty was a time when colonization by European nations was still rapidly expanding around the world. In fact, when that dynasty began, English colonists had only recently settled along the east coast of North America. Much later in the Qing dynasty, ships regularly sailed from North America to trade with China. For example, in the 1830s, trading ships would sail from Great Britain's Fort Vancouver on the west coast of North America to Canton in China. At this outpost, ships were loaded with valuable furs, which were in great demand in China. In China, the furs were traded for items such as Chinese pottery, silk, and tea that were shipped back to Great Britain and sold for a profit. But the Qing emperors put severe limitations on trade that angered the Europeans and eventually led to armed conflicts and invasions. The Europeans forced the emperor to open up more ports to their ships, and the emperor had to agree to turn the Chinese city of Hong Kong into a full-fledged British colony. Finally, in 1912, the decline of the Qing dynasty ended when China's last emperor, who was only a young child at the time, was forced by revolutionaries to give up his throne. And by then, 2,133 years had passed since Qin Shi Huang had declared himself to be the first emperor of China. After the collapse of imperial China, the man pictured here, named Sun Yat-sen, became an important leader in China by promoting the ideals of democracy, socialism, and nationalism. But stable democratic government did not take hold in China, and the nation underwent a communist revolution and a brutal invasion by Japan as well. In 1949, communist forces led by Mao Zedong defeated the army of China's nationalist government, and the People's Republic of China was born. Following their defeat, the Chinese nationalists established themselves on the island of Taiwan, while the communists ruled from the old capital of Beijing. Toward the end of the 20th century, after decades of severe repression, the communist government began to relax its regulations outlawing capitalism. And in spite of the persistent poverty that still afflicts its huge rural population, the results have been truly astounding. For in an extremely short period of time, China has transformed itself into the factory for the world and become the home of the fastest-growing economy on earth. China's cities are booming places with serious pollution problems, where new buildings seem to sprout up overnight. Most new construction in China provides improved housing, so it is typical to see old neighborhoods being torn down to make way for new apartment buildings. In China, wages are quite low, but so are people's rental and medical expenses. China is now, as it always has been, the world's most populous country. However, today, in order to stop its disastrous population explosion, the government has decreed that families must have no more than one child, while increasing wealth is allowing more people to own cars in this mostly bicycle-riding nation, an event that is contributing enormously to the worldwide shortage of oil. But in spite of its many difficulties, China has clearly regained its rightful place among the Earth's most powerful nations. True or false? The first Chinese emperor ordered the construction of the Great Wall of China. True or false? The original Silk Road linked China to the Roman Empire. True or false? Mongolians ruled China during the Ming Dynasty. True or false? Spain was the first nation to find a sea route from Europe to East Asia. True or false? Sun Yat-sen led China's communist revolution.